Welcome everyone. Welcome to the CES Senior Thesis Conference entitled Nationalisms, New and Old. I'm Michael Torek, and I, along with my co-organizer for this conference, Sally Hayes, are delighted to welcome you. So this conference is one of our important events in the thesis workshop for juniors, which the Center for European Studies runs. The main aim of this workshop is to help undergraduates, especially juniors, find what they want to research and where they want to travel for that research. In the context of CS, it's obviously geared towards Europe. But unfortunately, given the pandemic and the challenges which it's brought, travel which is not possible this last summer. However, recognizing that students still need opportunities and support for research for their thesis projects, academic projects, CES, in its generosity and its quick action, provided these students who will be presenting today with remote research grants in order to facilitate their research, their academic needs towards them. So today we see some of those first fruits, and it's quite aptly titled, obviously, Nationalisms, New and Old. This is a theme that organizes many of the diverse presentations we'll have today, and one that resonates very much with what is going on not only in Europe, but also all around the world. I want to, as always, thank CES for its generosity in supporting our workshop and the efforts we do with these wonderful undergraduates. I especially want to thank Vasilis Koutafaris and Laura Falloon for their support and logistical aid throughout this workshop. We would be absolutely lost without them, so we're very grateful to them in particular. So to give you a basic sense of the organization of our conference today, so we will begin with our presenters giving short presentations. Then we will move to our commentary with our faculty member, Derek Penzlar. Then we will, after that commentary, move to the presenters being able to respond to the various insights and questions. And then we will open up to a general Q&A, which I will run via the chat in order to do it most efficiently so we can get the most number of questions and responses. So without any further ado, I will turn it over to my co-organizer, Sally Hayes, and we will start now.
Hello, everyone. Welcome, and thank you so much for being here. These students have been preparing for weeks and months to give us a little slice of how their projects are developing. And this is a particularly exciting workshop because our comments and the insights generated here can assist them in what will eventually be the final project that they wrap up in the spring. So without further ado, I am delighted to introduce Hannah Craig, whose work is entitled Children of the Ceasefire, an analysis of the post-Good Friday generation in Northern Ireland. Hannah comes to us from the Department of History and Literature. Take it away, Hannah.
Hello, everybody. Thank you very much, Sally, for the introduction there. I'd just like to start my presentation with a quick video. I'm going to share my screen now for that. Let me know if you, sorry about that. Can you guys see the screen okay? Perfect. Okay. So this is a well-known song from the Cranberries called Zombie. It was filmed in Belfast, Northern Ireland, which is the geographical location my thesis is focusing on. In this short scene that I'm going to show you guys, I'd love for you to just focus on the walls in the background. They are significant to my project. So without further ado, I'll play it. Okay, so that was just a short video there that really inspired actually my interest in the symbols of peace walls. So in September of 1969, the British Army, when they entered into Belfast, erected the first, what was known today as Peace Wall in Northern Ireland. These walls were constructed at a very alarming rate in the 1970s, just as physical barriers to separate Catholics and Protestants during the Troubles, which was a conflict that went on from 1968 to 1998 between Catholics and Protestants. So these walls were erected as temporary solutions to combat violence between these two communities. However, since 1998, when there was an agreement made between Catholics and Protestants, one well-known group being the IRA, declared a ceasefire, and we entered into this era of peace in Northern Ireland from then on. Despite such commendable progress, what I realized in my research was that these peace walls have actually increased in size and numbers. So they were anything from fences to gates, security barriers, everything you saw in that video there. And a lot of them went from being 10 feet tall to 50 feet and increase in numbers. So today in Belfast, there's estimated to be 97 of these walls. And this definitely shocked me just because of the existence of them, sort of raises concerns surrounding the extent to which peace has actually been achieved here in Northern Ireland. And in 2013, the government recognised this paradox of a peace wall and announced plans to remove them by 2023, so not long away, which has caused a lot of anxiety between both the older generation who witnessed the terrible violence and are still traumatized by it in many respects today, and my generation, sort of those who were born in this era of peace, because they themselves have actually not known a Belfast without these walls, so it defines their movement and their everyday activities. So with all that being said, the main question I'm addressing in my thesis is sort of how do the points of view towards peace walls compare and contrast between the post-Good Friday generation and the older generation, and how these attitudes have changed from their construction during the Troubles and in contemporary Northern Ireland. So my project momentarily has involved sort of charting the shift in the nature of the violence. I've noticed that it shifted from being an armed campaign with groups like the IRA and the Ulster Volunteer Force, sort of using bombs and tanks, which the Cranberries stated there, to much more territorial violence and recreational rioting. So how this shift in violence has contributed towards different experiences and perspectives from between the two generations. And finally, I've also noticed difference in attitudes in terms of how each generation feels protected. So previously in just surveys that have been done, there's statistics such as 57% say that they feel protected by the walls, but a survey can only go so far. So I'm looking into what does that actually mean. And precisely for the older generation, they feel protected in the sense that there's no longer bombings. And when they were younger, one family I was speaking to were saying how they had to go up the street with a mattress held up to protect them from bullets. So they feel protected, yet the younger generation have a very different perspective in terms of protection. So, and just in terms of the support of whether they feel that they should be removed or not. So yeah, very excited to see how this goes, and just want to say thank you so much to CES for their support, and I'm glad I've been able to share my project so far with you guys.
Thank you, Hannah. Now, for our next panelist, we are turning to Eliza Omler. The title of her project is A Study of Scottish Nationalism Under Brexit, and she comes to us from sociology and also global health and health policy. Eliza, welcome.
Hi, I also have a presentation, so I'm going to share my screen. Alrighty, can we all see that? Okay, great. So I've been studying this past summer Scottish nationalism under Brexit. My guiding research question was, how did Brexit change and shape Scottish identity and politics? I used the works of Benedict Anderson's Imagined Communities and Mary Bernstein's Identity Politics to really situate me within this literature. And I focused my research on 3 topics: Brexit, the 2014 Scottish independence referendum, and then I also measured attitudes on COVID currently. So I interviewed people over Zoom this past summer. I interviewed 21 young Scottish people between the ages of 19 to 26. About half were female and half were male, a little more than half from urban areas and the rest from rural. And they were mostly from the University of St. Andrews. Some of them were from the University of Dundee or other universities in the area. And to the right, there's this graph of their self-reported political party affiliation. So a little less than half were members of the Scottish National Party, which is the ruling party in Scotland at the moment that is pro-independence. And then a little more than half split other ways. You can see right here, it says Lib Dems. You can't see it, but in parentheses, it says for voting purposes only. So a few people mentioned that they voted for Liberal Democrats just because they felt they were viable in their area, but were more closely aligned with other parties such as Labour. And so for, is this moving? There we go. For Brexit, 20 out of 21 people opposed Brexit, and the number one reason, or something that came up most consistently in relation to Brexit, was this feeling of Scotland being ignored by Westminster. So I don't know if you're aware, but Scotland only has 59 seats out of the 650 parliament seats in Westminster. So even if Scotland voted consistently all across their own MPs, they still don't really make a huge impact in Westminster. And a lot of people mentioned that. They also brought up historical tensions within Scotland and England and this general feeling of kind of English oppression of Scotland. And so that history has become very ripe and brought up these tensions within Brexit. Additionally, something that people often mentioned about Brexit was that they felt that it was a racist campaign that stemmed from xenophobic tendencies, and they didn't felt that this aligned with Scottish values, which was another reason why they opposed it. One of the most interesting things I found, though, was the identity shift that Brexit started among these young people. So I had people rank identities from closest to farthest of what they felt to themselves, and that was Scottish, British, European, and English. Most people said Scottish was their first identity, and then about half of folks said British was their second, and another half said European was their second. And for those that mentioned that European was their second closest identity, they actually mentioned Brexit as an impetus, like for that, why they felt more European than British, because I have this quote here from one participant who sort of explains it. Basically that they feel much more aligned with European values and European politics as a result of Brexit, and they don't feel that Brexit represents who they are, and thus they feel less tied to their British identity over their European one. Independence, however, so independence for Scotland, it was not as clear-cut at all. So I measured people's attitudes of independence of what they were in 2014 and what it would be now if there was a second referendum. So it was kind of split half and half in 2014. Some people, about half of the people were opposed to it and half the people voted yes or would have voted yes if they could vote. But in 2020, these attitudes were still not as clear-cut, but much more in favor of independence than opposed to independence. And then this chart, there are a few people who could be swayed either way, so that data is not included in this, but the reason for that also is Brexit, that a lot of people felt that they'd rather be a member of the EU or just not be attached to Brexit than be a member of the UK. So because of Brexit, there was a huge shift in attitudes towards independence as well. And then finally, I just captured people's attitudes on COVID to see if this changed their thinking at all about these topics. And by and large, people said that COVID did not change their thinking, but actually strengthened it. So there are some quotes here for some people who basically just say that COVID really just made them more in whatever their opinions were before, especially because Scotland, in their eyes, seems to be doing better with COVID than England, and that had a huge impact on how they're thinking about these issues. So currently, I'm just doing my literature review, and it's been a great time just writing this up. And I want to thank the Center for European Studies again for inviting me and for helping with this research. And thank you to everyone else for coming and watching this.
Thank you, Eliza. Now we turn to Francesco Rolando. His project is entitled Healthcare as a Border, Migrants' Access to and Exclusion from Healthcare Services in Turin, Italy. He comes to us from social studies and from molecular and cellular biology. Welcome, Francesco.
Thank you so much, Sally. So about a week ago, another makeshift vessel capsized in the Mediterranean, killing 6 people, including a six-month-old infant named Joseph. Just like in 2015, when the refugee crisis truly began, disaster materialized in the lifeless body of a child, which last week even managed to distract the news machine from the worsening public health emergency caused by COVID-19. According to the Missing Migrant Project of the International Organization for Migration, a minimum of 19,204 people have lost their life trying to cross the Mediterranean since 2014. Discussions around migration in Europe have often focused on physical borders, both in the media and academia, and without diminishing the suffering of the thousands of people trying to cross them. Anthropologists like Tazzioli, Fasson, De Genova, and Anderson, just to name a few, have noted how the spectacle of statistics and images contribute to the crisis narratives that are used to describe the migration crisis in Europe, which in turn called for the implementation of temporary and extraordinary measures, and ultimately to the strengthening of the same security apparatus that forced people on more dangerous migratory journeys in the first place. Beyond narratives of crisis, and far from the physical borders of Europe, other forms of exclusion happen across the heterogeneous boundaries that separate citizens and foreigners. With the scholars I mentioned above in mind, I propose to investigate the interface between immigrants and the state and the point of access to welfare services in Italy. In particular, in my thesis, the question I address is whether healthcare services act as boundaries to separate the citizens and the non-citizen. In other words, what is the role of healthcare in defining the migrant in contemporary Italy? So healthcare services are an ideal point of entry to understand the interactions between migrants and the state, especially in Italy, for 3 main reasons. The first being national healthcare system are the most developed means of economic redistribution in Southern Europe. Secondly, unlike most other services, state-dispensed medical care can be accessed in different forms by all people in the country, no matter their legal status. And finally, anthropologists have produced insightful scholarship on the role of healthcare in defining and creating the migrant other in different countries, such as France, Germany, Israel, and specifically in Italy. There has been an increasing attention to the tension between the universalistic right to health enshrined in the Italian constitution on one side, and different bureaucratic, medical, and linguistic barriers, which exclude certain groups from enjoying this right fully. In order to investigate this topic, I conducted participant observation and interviews in Turin, the capital city of the Piedmont region in northern Italy, which is where I'm from. Turin was one of the industrial poles during the Italian economic miracle, so that its landscape and social textures have been shaped by internal migration at first and international migration in the last few decades. So movement in the city is actually a stable component of its urban life. Through my thesis, I will argue that healthcare services participate in creating the unstable temporalities that define non-citizen, mainly those who are undocumented, giving rise to what I call temporaneous existences. I use this term to describe the lived experience of people shaped by temporary documents, by temporary contracts, temporary accommodation, and so on, while recognizing that this limited temporality is superimposed by structures of movement and not intrinsic to their being. I argue that healthcare services participate in this process because while the principle of continuity of care is upheld by national laws and regional regulations, the interactions between undocumented migrants and the national healthcare system consists of bursts of political affirmation as they lay a claim to what is due to them by law. In laying a claim to the state, the foreigner becomes visible, but visibility might lead to expulsion. Other forms of care offered by civil society and private charitable organizations preserve the invisibility of the migrant other and attempt to create continuous relationship with them. However, these services are often provided through the compassionate action of volunteers and are tied to private and discontinuous form of funding removed from the obligation of public officials. At the center of my argument is a contradiction that the migrant as foreigner faces being forced to choose between precarious continuity of care and moments of political existence afforded through exception. Services are provided on a temporary basis to uphold human rights and deal with emergency, but stable long-term migratory pathways are ephemeral and disappointing. So my ethnographic studies of the healthcare provision, therefore, brings to light forms of temporal discontinuity that characterize the lived experience of migrants in Northern Italy. It brings to the surface a form of conditional hospitality which produces and reproduces the power structures proper to the modern European nation state. Thank you so much to the Center for European Studies for having me here and for their support.
Thank you very much. Now we move to Leo Sanger. His project is entitled Over Tourism and Its Impacts on the Authenticity of Venetian Streetscapes. And he comes to us from Applied Mathematics. Welcome, Leo.
Hi, can you hear me okay and see the presentation? I have a couple slides to share. Great. I'll start a timer for myself. I try to keep it to 5 minutes, but thanks again to the Center for European Studies for having me. I'm really grateful for the support. And a quick note that I'm actually a junior, so I'm taking time off now. So I think the research is at a bit of a different point than some of the other ones, but hopefully you all will still find it interesting. So my question is as follows: how do seasonal patterns of tourism shape Venice? How different communities of tourists drive changes in the built environment? And then post COVID-19, what do these shifts mean for the city's future? So as a quick note, I'm going to go pretty quickly through a lot of maps. These are all available on my website and interactive, so you can scroll through different time series, and I have a link there as well. So if you want to take a look through those as I'm talking, I won't be offended. Go for it. So previously, I worked actually in a team with Yuki to develop this granular tourism index. So whereas there are just these huge influxes of tourists that come to Venice every year, the places in which they locate and the touristification of different areas varies dramatically. And the question now is, how can we use this information on how tourism is spatially distributed through Venice to then think about how Venice might rebuild post-COVID-19 to create a more kind of sustainable model of tourism? In other words, we went from 170,000 residents in 1950 to 50,000 in 2017 with over 30 million tourists. So post-COVID, what comes next? I'll look at changes in TripAdvisor reviews, Airbnb data, and show that there's an opportunity to kind of decenter tourism in Venice, make life more sustainable, but we don't have to sacrifice the benefits of tourism for the community. So a lot of this work was scraping data, which was pretty difficult. We have from around 300,000 reviews from 500 restaurants in Venice, representing 2,000 distinct locations, as well as data from Airbnb from 2014 to 2020 at like a host reviewer level. So that's like even more, I don't know, millions of observations. Then from that, we can also look at Airbnbs that are deactivated. So first, those graphs that I showed you before, kind of at an aggregate level, you can see obviously there's this huge decrease around March 2020. You can't travel internationally, but what's not obvious is there's this kind of shift within Europe towards both Italian tourism, so within Italy, as well as towards German, Swiss, and English tourism. This is from TripAdvisor reviews that were geolocated. And whereas there's some kind of bounce back, the composition of tourists changes dramatically. And when we look kind of under the surface too, this is using Airbnb data now, looking at the modal country in different areas in Venice. This is before we have these kind of large clusters of, like, let's say, American tourists kind of tend to locate in these very popular areas, French, UK, and different areas. There's a lot of heterogeneity that emerges post-COVID where we have like these groups of German tourists, Italian tourists, UK and different areas. And what you can't really see here so clearly is that a lot of these more outer areas are gaining a lot more popularity relative to the city center before. And that part of these different patterns of tourist origins are also driving changes in where Airbnbs actually locate. Again, right, we have these aggregate numbers of Airbnbs, but within under the surface, this recovery masks the fact that it's not only kind of unevenly distributed between different areas, whereas these moved in lockstep before. There's a lot of divergence post-COVID. There's also a difference in the kinds of hosts that are dropping out from the market and the kinds of hosts that are continuing. So I'll show just very briefly, I think it's interesting, there's this incredible consolidation within like the top 1%, the top like 8 or so hosts having just a very large disproportionate share of the revenue and also of the recovery post-COVID in terms of reservations. Like most of these Airbnbs that I'll show are entering the market come from these smaller hosts that are maybe only have 1 or 2 properties within the city. But the real kind of punchline here is that there are around 500 Airbnb. We reached in August 500 Airbnbs a month that are delisting from Airbnb and presumably re-entering the market for other purposes. So this opens up, and the vast majority of those being in the city center, this opens up kind of the opportunity for some of this like shifting towards outer areas that I was talking about previously. And I'll try to wrap it up quickly here, but you can see, I mean, if you can look at these maps in a little bit more detail. I told you they're on my website, but some of the shift towards those outer areas, sorry for the background noise, the shift towards those outer areas helps kind of open up the possibility for more tourism there, but we've shown also that those outer areas don't have the same kinds of qualities in the built environment that might suggest that they have the potential to become very over touristified. So what I want to do is to try to relate those two things more closely together, the built environment, what kind of is associated with tourism, as well as those new patterns that are emerging, to show how Venice might be able to capitalize on those new patterns to create kind of a different model of tourism for the future. How we can use those less popular regions to catalyze maybe a shift in how locals deal with and how it's distributed over the city. Apologies of going a little bit over time. And thanks to sorry for having to go so quickly, but you can see this all, like I said, you can pull up those maps. It's just leosangro.com/map1, map2, map3. But yes, thank you.
Thank you, Leo. Now we're going to welcome Nathaniel Steele, whose work is entitled Aesthetics and Politics, Adorno in the Present. He comes to us from social studies and music. Welcome.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me. I'm actually in a similar situation to Leo in that I'm not currently at the college, but I'm very excited to be here to share a little bit about my thesis work over the summer. I don't have a slideshow. My thesis is focused on more of the theory side of things. So unfortunately, I don't have a website or any cool graphs to show you. I can tell you a little about my thesis. So nearing the end of my sophomore year, I had the chance to read The Dialectic of Enlightenment, a book by Theodor Adorno and Max Horkheimer. And it was a book that I really struggled to understand, but I was also very much drawn in by the book, in particular their account of the culture industry. In brief, Adorno and Horkheimer argue that mass-produced cultural products, commercial art, movies, pop music, that sort of thing, are detrimental to society, manipulating consumers into false satisfaction and complacency under late capitalism. This theory resonated with me in certain ways, but moreover, I was fascinated by their intersectional analysis of arts and politics. I quickly learned that Adorno and Horkheimer were members of the Frankfurt School, a group of German political and social theorists founded during the Weimar Republic, who grew out of the philosophical traditions of Western Marxism. The Frankfurt School combines aspects of continental philosophy, psychoanalysis, sociology, and other intellectual traditions in their own self-reflective style of social critique, which is referred to as critical theory. They are known for their focus on cultural analysis, in addition to the economic analysis that more traditionally characterizes Marxist thought. I became particularly interested in Adorno because of his personal focus on the realm of music. Adorno was not just a philosopher and social theorist, but a trained musicologist who took a unique approach to musical analysis. Adorno was classically trained as a pianist in his early life. Later on, he studied composition with the famed atonal composer Alban Berg, and was well involved in the circles of the Second Viennese School, which was a compositional group founded by Schoenberg, Berg, Webern, and their pupils in the 1930s. So in accordance with the cultural upheavals racking Europe in the interwar period, the composers of this Second Viennese School were experimenting with atonality, serial music, and other composition methods in order to fundamentally disrupt the traditional foundations of Western music. In this way, the efforts of the Second Viennese School are thematically similar to the work of the Frankfurt School theorists who were attempting a rebuke of the traditional foundations of Western philosophy. The parallels between this group of composers and the Frankfurt School are not merely analogous, and Adorno functioned as a link between these two groups. In fact, Adorno's primary means of subsistence in the earlier years of his life actually came from his writings as a music critic. So he was very much in conversation with these composers. The goal of my thesis is to explore the conflict between aesthetic and social theory, two different areas of philosophy which overlap a lot more than one may think. Many philosophers over the years have investigated the antagonisms inherent in any attempt to unify these spheres, the possible resolution of these antagonisms, and what is to be gained from the resolution or in the efforts to achieve a resolution between these two spheres of philosophy. My thesis investigates these broad tensions in the writings of Theodor Adorno, seeking to demonstrate the ways in which Adorno's aesthetic theory may be viewed as a vehicle or an extension of his social theory, as well as the ways in which it may not. The Frankfurt School set out to disrupt and revolutionize. How does art fit into that project? What is art's role in modernity? And can we harness it to affect change? A large part of this analysis is it will involve exploring Adorno's writings on music with the aim of demonstrating why Adorno believed music to be a particularly significant aesthetic form, and how music in particular intersects with Adorno's social theory. In doing so, the thesis hopes to interrogate Adorno's writings on music from a serious social theory perspective. Many philosophers display a particular affinity for one artistic discipline with varying degrees of justification, and Adorno posits a unique connection between music and critical theory. I don't really have time to get into the connection right now, but I can quickly summarize that so through this connection between music and critical theory, Adorno is able to sort of plumb the depths of music as an art form to engage critically with society. He interrogates music on many levels, from the concrete to the super abstract, and all of this is relates back to, is a function of social and political theory. So I'll try and give a short example. Adorno was an early critic of the radio. It seems like a weird thing to critique, but he really hated the radio, and he repeatedly argued that the rebroadcasting of music led to its further commodification, to the detriment of the art form and to the detriment of the audience's ability to genuinely listen to and appreciate music. Commodification of music is a part of the culture industry, which, as aforementioned, Adorno identifies as a key element of the oppression inherent in late capitalism. Thus, Adorno sort of is able to interrogate broad societal issues through the seemingly innocuous topic of how we listen to music. This is just a tiny example, but hopefully it helps demonstrate the interplay between aesthetics and politics that Adorno is able to achieve. My ultimate goal with this thesis is to explain why I think this sort of aesthetic social approach is fruitful and worthwhile. Adorno's social aesthetic approach originated in the tumult of interwar Germany, but it remains deeply relevant to the social and political situation in modern Europe and beyond. So I just want to thank CES for affording me the opportunity to spend the summer working on this, and I'm very excited to continue this work.
Thank you very much. So now we turn to Taylor Witzel. Taylor's work is entitled Explaining Stagnation in Domestic War Crimes Prosecutions in Bosnia-Herzegovina, Croatia, and Serbia. He comes to us from Government and European History, Politics and Societies. Welcome, Taylor.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So can everybody hear me? All right, let me share my screen. I have a presentation. Okay, so yeah, thank you so much, CES, for providing me this opportunity. And so my work has actually shifted since I first did the proposal, and I am now focusing on explaining variation in the quality and efficiency of domestic war crimes prosecutions, specifically in Bosnia and Herzegovina. So I can just jump right in. So I want to start with a quote. They were beating us, they were raping women. I saw with my own eyes the worst scenes that only happen in movies. The eyes of an 8-year-old, and in my mind, the question echoed, why us? Since then, the same question echoes through my mind. I still hope that justice will prevail. I am here to fight in the name of the 8-year-old and the 36-year-old. I am the only survivor. They killed my whole family, parents, and siblings. So my project was kind of spurred by the fact that in Bosnia, justice has been delayed and denied for many victims of war crimes during the 1990s disintegration of the former Yugoslavia. And part of that is a result of the fact that the ICTY concluded only prosecuting around 160 of the kind of top big fish generals in the war. And most of the work has since shifted to domestic judicial systems, which have been underexplored in the academic literature. So in my thesis, I'm primarily looking at the State Court of Bosnia. And on this slide, you see some statistics that since 2014 and potentially sooner, the backlog of war crimes cases at the State Court of Bosnia has not been being reduced at the appropriate level in order to meet the targeted goals. And so in my thesis, I am asking the question of what explains temporal variation in the quality and efficiency of war crimes prosecutions in Bosnia. So this is my main research question, which I conceptualize the main dependent variable along the lines of quality and efficiency, because it's really important to recognize that both of those are crucial ingredients to understanding the recent deterioration that we've seen. So while I mentioned the backlog, there are other indicators of efficiency, such as length of the trials, how many indictments are actually being issued, et cetera. However, it's also important to take into account quality, because you can have a certain number of cases, but are these cases actually the complex cases that they're supposed to be pursuing? Are the indictments actually successful? What is the conviction rate? So as I've noted before, we've seen a really concerning deterioration in the past decade, and it's not necessarily clear at the outset why. So in my thesis research, I've identified 3 main independent variables that I believe could potentially explain what's going on: international pressure, judicial capacity, and political corruption. And so these 3 independent variables lead into 3 different hypotheses. The first is that this is a story of international pressure. If international pressure has decreased, so too will the efficiency and quality of the prosecutions. If judicial capacity, it could also be a story of resources. So are they not having the appropriate resources or capability to prosecute? Thirdly, corruption could be at play, and this could potentially result in worse quality and efficient domestic war crimes prosecutions in Bosnia. And so in order to kind of evaluate these independent variables and really investigate what's going on here, I'm employing a variety of methods. So the first method that I've been pretty much pursuing since the summer has been semi-structured and key informant interviews with relevant actors who would have insight on what's going on. And this kind of qualitative research really gives me the ability to dig into what is maybe not being reported in the news or what is maybe not available data-wise. However, I also plan to do analysis on data of war crimes prosecutions over the years, as well as analysis of primary documents, so trial court records, news coverage, etc. And I'll unite my methods in a process tracing framework so that I can really provide a granular analysis over time of looking at why this deterioration is occurring. So far, as a result mainly of my interviews, I have determined that corruption is the most compelling explanation of a root cause for what's going on here in Bosnia. However, as I kind of assumed at the outset, and why I wanted to take a process tracing approach, was that international pressure and judicial capacity also have a role to play, but perhaps in a different way. So at this point in my research, I have a hypothesized causal story. So I believe that political interests and corruption are at the root of the deterioration that we've seen in Bosnia. And primarily, I believe that international pressure and oversight serves as an enabling factor. And what I mean by that is at the outset, this court was a hybrid court, meaning that it had foreign judges and prosecutors as members of the court and the prosecution office. All of those people left at the end of 2012, and I believe that that really served to enable political interests to gain more influence over the judiciary. So whether that's appointment of prosecutors or whether that is intervening on certain cases to protect political functionaries who still have not been prosecuted because and are still involved in politics because the war was only a few decades ago, that really enabled those interests to kind of take over. And that has manifested in problematic practices in the prosecutor's office. For example, some prosecutors, in order to try to meet the quota system, will fragment cases that really should not be fragmented. They want to look like they're actually doing their job, but they're not. Also, some of the prosecutors don't have experience prosecuting in this way, so they don't know how to write a good indictment. And so this has been really focused on by the OSCE, other NGOs, and journalists as kind of the cause of the deterioration. But I had a hunch that something else was going on and that it didn't make sense why these practices just emerged on their own. And so that's kind of where I see the contribution of my research. And so this has led to less efficient and worse quality prosecutions, as I currently understand in the middle of my research. So just wrapping up here, I'm going to continue. I'm on a gap year right now. So next summer, I will be continuing an internship in Bosnia where I'll pursue in-person interviews, which should give me a little bit more insight into especially some of these kind of political dynamics that I'm talking about. I also want to gather more data on the war crimes cases, potentially use a few case studies to really demonstrate this process that I've identified. And I also would like to potentially apply my findings to another case if it makes sense. So thanks so much, everybody. That is it for me. Sorry if I went over, but really appreciate the support from CES and the opportunity to share this with you guys today.
Thank you, Taylor. Now we turn to Yuki Zhang with a project entitled Housing with Permanence, an adaptation of Venetian domestic architecture to promote residential living. He comes to us from computer science and the history of art and architecture. Welcome, Yuki.
Thanks. Hi, everybody. First of all, thanks to CS for the generous grant and for having me here. I'm really excited to present to you guys today. So as Leo mentioned, I worked with him in the spring on essentially the problem that Venice is facing with over-tourism and their rapidly decaying residential population. And so just to quickly explain some of the work that we did this past spring, one of the contributions I made was to visualize this decaying population in Venice. And so I created an interactive visualization to show this decaying population. And another component that we worked on was creating this index to track the levels of touristification in different parts of Venice based on things like having really touristy restaurants, having lots of Airbnbs, and you see a huge density in the center of the city. And this is going to play a role later on in my presentation. The second part, which I conducted over the summer, was to study the historical influence of urban transformation on Venetian demographics. So I'm really interested in urban design and architecture. And so I thought looking into some of the impactful urban changes over time could provide insights into why Venice's population has historically had a huge flux. And so I compiled a timeline of the historical maps of Venice, tracing some of the large urban changes, including the construction of the land bridge, as well as topographical changes. And this is also put in relationship to the population curve as well. So anyone can go on this website and sort of explore those changes and relationships and find insights on their own. Which leads me to my third and final part, which I've been conducting in the fall, titled Housing with Permanence. And so I was interested in zooming in on one of these types of urban and architectural changes. And I found the most interesting one to be the fact that increasingly landowners, property owners are subdividing their properties into multiple apartments in order to increase the amount of money that they can charge tourists by having multiple apartments to rent out to tourists. And so this is a largely illegal practice in Venice, and yet it's hard for the authorities to really stop this practice from occurring. And it's driving rent prices up. It's also providing less housing for permanent residents. And so I was interested in looking at thinking about reorganizing the interior architecture of Venetian domestic space in order to prevent subdivisions from happening and to promote permanent residence. And so one of the ways I went about this was to first figure out which sites would best serve this kind of intervention. So I looked at the tourist resident threshold in Venice, where inside the red boundary is majority tourists. And so I was thinking that by operating these interventions near the border of this threshold, it could potentially emit some pressure on this tourist bubble and bring some of the land of Venice back to the Venetians. And so I first looked at this Dorsoduro site, which funnily enough actually it has a booking.com listing. And so using using these images, I was able to infer a floor plan of this site. And the actual listing is this left half. And you can see it's actually been subdivided into 2 apartments, which is really exemplar of the issue that I've been talking about and I'm interested in, which is the rampant subdivision of apartments to sell to rent to tourists. And what's interesting about this site is it's sort of on this dividing line between the touristy area and the residential area, where on the touristy side you have a museum directly across. It's this building that really stands out and it's quite beautiful. And you also have a really important basilica nearby. And on the other side, it directly opens into the neighborhood courtyard. And so I was interested in examining the sight lines available in this property in order to motivate a reorganization of the interior space. And so this is my intervention, a sketch of my intervention plan in which the quote unquote public space in this apartment, so the living room, would be oriented towards the courtyard such that it would encourage more interaction with the community, as opposed to having those facilities be oriented towards the museum and the basilica. And in addition, I also incorporated more of an open plan such that subdivision would be much more difficult. And so that's basically what I've been working on. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. So we do have one more panelist, Emily Markowitz, who is on her way. She has a class that ends at 5, and we had built in time. We thought that she would end up coming in right as our second to last presenter was wrapping up and would speak last. But you've all been so efficient and respectful of the time limit that we are ready to move straight to commentary. So after commentary, Emily will speak, and we will just give the floor to our kind commentator, Derek Penslar, who as a CES affiliate has given so much to this group already, and whose words we have been very eager to hear. So thank you, Derek. Welcome.
Thanks very much. So I've been writing, I read the versions that were submitted to me, and I've also been listening. So I've been writing notes, and so I just need to figure out the best way to read from my notes that are on my computer while I look at all of you. So I'm going to minimize that. So I'm going to go more or less in alphabetical order, not exactly. So I'll save my comments for Emily, but I'll just start with Hannah's. First of all, this is a topic of great personal interest to me, given how much I work on Israel-Palestine and issues of separation and walls. I thought it was particularly poignant about the wall's ongoing presence and salience in the post-1998 era as factors of consolidating or sources of consolidation of territory and identity It's disheartening given conventional understandings of the successes of the disengagement and the reduction of hostilities in the wake of the Good Friday Accords. We tend to be mainly aware of these ongoing tensions during marching season, but now we see that it's chronic. But on a positive side, you have mentioned that peace walls have come down. And I'd be very interested to know about the situations, not only where they stay up, but where they come down and why. My wife and I spent a fair amount of time in Derry, Londonderry, and so I'd be interested in that city in particular. It tends to be a little bit less of a flashpoint these days, I think, than Belfast. I want to recommend also a couple of scholars who do comparative work about peace walls in a kind of broader perspective. Elie Carmon, security specialist in Israel, who's done work comparing peace walls in Ireland and security barriers in Israel. Laura Robson, who works on comparative partition in Ireland and in Palestine and the role of walls. Anyway, I could give you the names, but I think it's a really exciting topic, and I very much like the presentation. So I won't talk about Emily right now. Then to Eliza. So I think this is a really promising project, and I think the main thing I hope you'll do as you move forward is, I wonder, first of all, is it possible to expand the interview pool? And I just don't know where you are with the research, because they are fairly homogeneous, because they are university students. I understand, many are from one university, few are from another. They're fairly homogeneous. But if it's not possible to expand the interview pool, that would be okay, because that's where the scholarly and journalistic literature can come in. Because to me, the really interesting question is, to what extent your findings confirm or challenge the existing and abundant, punditry on this issue. And just as a question of fact, it'll be interesting for you to look at the last 8-9 months of COVID rates in Scotland, and see if they bear out this notion that it's better by us than somewhere else, because people like to say that their COVID rates aren't so bad compared to somewhere else. It's sort of a way of justifying or rationalizing and warding off fear. I mean, I know that COVID rates are very high now in the Midlands. I know because my daughter is actually in the COVID capital of England, in Nottingham. But it's not as bad as in the South. So to what extent are people in Scotland manipulating the rates to make them feel good about themselves? But then really most important is the question of where and how your interviewees' views were formed. One thing I'm coming across in some survey work that I've come by about how students form their views about, let's say, the Middle East, is how little students actually pick up at university, and how much of their core political values are picked up at home or in non-academic social circles or in secondary school. And given that you're talking to university students and that the referendum was a few years ago, they might very well have been in secondary school at the time. So I just think it'd be really interesting to think about how and where these views were formed. Okay, Francesco, Rolando, really fascinating issue about how new arrivals qualify for healthcare in really any country that has universal care, and where universal care has a brand value. So for example, I'm Canadian American, and what makes Canada, its brand is very much that it has universal health care. The United Kingdom has the National Health Service and so on. Very different from the US, or for that matter, China. So I'm familiar with this understanding of a gray zone where you enter a country and you, at least in a lot of these countries, maybe not in Italy, in a lot of these countries, anyone who has entered the country has access to care through the National Health Service, through the NHS, or through whatever provincial system you have in Canada. There will be a nominal charge, and I understand these people are poor, but the charges are really, by American standards, extremely low. And I'm wondering if that's what the third sector fundraisers or the philanthropies you're talking about are doing, or are they providing simply a different system? Are they providing them doctors who work specifically for these charities? These people are going to hospital, I assume they're going to state hospitals. So is it a question of who's paying the bills, or is it a question of actually the providers of medical service? At what point does the migrant, as use that term in quotes, to Italy qualify for national health care? At what point are they no longer dependent on this third sector assistance? And then last, and perhaps most important, how do political leaders justify not providing this health care? Because again, outside of the United States, it's widely assumed in many countries that if someone has an infectious disease, you know, it's bad for everybody. If someone can't work, it's bad for everyone. So there is a notion of public good. And so I'm interested in how this lack of medical care is justified, but it's a wonderful project. For Nate, I only have a couple of short suggestions, which is that if I were to think about the Frankfurt School critical theory of the kind of mid-20th century and the relationship between the aesthetic and the political, the first two names that would come to mind are Walter Benjamin and Siegfried Kracauer. Because with Benjamin, in his famous essay on art in the age of mechanical production, he has a whole theory that may or may not apply to music, although he did write about music, because he has a notion of a kind of physical aura that pieces of art have, and that concept may or may not apply to music. But he certainly, his writing combines the aesthetic and the political right from the start. And Siegfried Kracauer did write on music, on film music, and the relationship between the visual and the aural. And so it might be interesting to see to what extent Adorno is in conversation with these other figures. Then for Taylor, this is really interesting, about war crimes trials. I appreciate the framework you're putting it into because, after World War II, there's two kinds of war crimes trials. There's the ones that everyone's heard about, the international military tribunals in Nuremberg and in Tokyo. But then there were the war crimes trials on a national level, on a state level, Poland, Holland, eventually Germany. And some of the problems that you point to in Bosnia-Herzegovina apply in these other countries as well. And I think the key question or challenge I had when I was reading and hearing your presentation is what you mean by corruption. When we hear the word corruption, we usually think of venality and people who are taking bribes, but that's not what you're really getting at. You're getting at a desire to obstruct justice, political influences. And I'm wondering, is corruption maybe a term of art that we can use to describe people who want to obstruct a system because of political interests as opposed to, personal enrichment? And it's not entirely clear from the presentation why a failure to prosecute war crimes in the former, in Bosnia-Herzegovina weakens the legitimacy of the state. You say this a couple of times in the proposal, that this failure weakens the legitimacy of the state and strengthens the hands of separatists in the Bosnian Serb statelet, the Republika Srpska. And then actually one other question is, you mentioned that you're going to be your interviews. Well, who are your interviewees and what are their interests? Because clearly you've established there's a lot of political interests going on here that at work here, and how are you controlling for the political interests of your interviewees? But anyway, it's a marvelous project, really like publishable. I can see it published. Anyway, and then I'm going to talk about the Venice projects together, Leo Sanger and Yuki Zhang. Okay, so there's lots of data you've got. This is fantastic about the over-touristification of Venice and what COVID has done to it. One question I have is about where these neighborhoods are that you think could be developed. Are these the neighborhoods on the mainland? A couple of miles away from the heart of Venice, are you talking about Mestre? Wasn't clear. And how does one get to the traditional tourist center? I mean, for example, Piazza San Marco. How do you get from these quieter areas to the more touristy areas where everybody wants to go? So it's just interesting if you give a little bit more information about which parts of the city you think actually could benefit from these kinds of interventions. And then specifically with Yuki, I was thinking as I was reading about this problem of housing, the subdivision is an ongoing phenomenon all over the world. It's not just happening in Venice. I mean, it's happening in Jerusalem, it's happening in Tel Aviv, it's happening in London, it's happening even in Toronto, where I am now, which is not exactly Venice, but it's happening here as well. I think what's happening in Venice is a phenomenon on steroids, but it is a general problem of people trying to get more and more people packed into a small space. But it might be useful to think in terms of a spectrum. It also opens you up to more forms of architectural intervention. So for example, I was thinking about another city that's been destroyed by tourism, Bruges, and to what extent there are similar problems. Bruges does not get the kind of tourism Venice does, but it is a city that is no longer a living city. it is simply tourists thronging through. Because of the size of Belgium, a lot of people go as day trippers. So there is probably a lot less need for hotel accommodation in Bruges. But it just struck me that Venice is to Florence what Bruges is to Ghent. That Venice is a dead city that's just, packed with tourists. Florence is heavily touristed, but it is also a living city. Bruges there's not much of a city there. Ghent is beautiful and touristed, but it's also a living city. And to look maybe at the issue of housing, tourist housing, not only in Venice, but maybe in a comparative framework. So I'll stop there, and hopefully our last speaker has arrived.
Let's see, Emily, has Emily arrived?
I don't see.
I think she's not here yet. So let's take a first question.
So perhaps maybe let's start first with the presenters responding to Derek.
Yeah. Let's have a response and then see.
So let's go in order. Let's start with Hannah then, and then we'll go in order from there.
Yeah, thank you so much, Derek, for your input there. Very interesting to hear. And you mentioned Derry as a very important city within this concept of the walls. And I decided to focus on Belfast specifically just because the majority of the peace walls are located there. And your question regarding the extent to which they have been destroyed and the process of trying to get them down, what did shock me is that it is only a handful of walls that are being removed, and the general population here, especially those who are living in those sort of working class residential areas of Belfast, are strongly in support of keeping them there, which is in contrast to the people who have the luxury and are living in the suburbs, just because to them the troubles is over, they've moved on. Yet these people have physical reminders of these walls, knowing that the community that they are not affiliated with are living on the other side. So Belfast was the area I focused on, and yeah, just so many different stories. I've been conducting interviews throughout the past couple of months, and I've loved hearing just the very personal stories relating to everything from childhood experiences and how the trauma has continued for many people, and the wall serves as just as I said, a reminder. There was the younger generation. To them, it's just something that's been ingrained within their life. One child I spoke to said, well, if it's not broken, why fix it? Which to me was funny, just because you think, well, there are so many reasons why we should fix this problem, because it completely segregates communities and continues this tradition of differences between Catholics and Protestants within Northern Ireland. So yeah, a lot more to do, but thank you so much for your input.
So I see our last presenter has arrived. Hi, Emily.
Hello. Thank
Hi.
you for class that got out at 5
No problem at all. So we'll just pause. We'll pause the responses from the presenters, and we'll go with your presentation, and then Derek will have some comments for you, and then we'll kind of turn back to presenter responses and then general Q&A. So we'll turn it over to you then, Emily.
Yes,
Okay.
Welcome, Emily. So the title of Emily's project is System Populace and Policy Populace, a new lens for exploring the rise of populism in Western Europe. And she comes to us from economics and social studies. Welcome.
Sounds good. Sure. So I think that was my original thesis topic. And so it's kind of shifted a little bit since then to look at more so party organizational form and party politics as a whole. So essentially, the context of my thesis is looking at Western Europe now, where you start to see the rise of these anti-system parties. So in Italy, for instance, you have Podemos, or you have the Five Star Movement, which offers this new way of doing politics and a new organizational form of their political party. They really focus on direct democracy, and they have this online platform that allows people to deliberate, propose policy solutions, as well as vote. And you see this rise of parties offering direct democracy throughout other countries in Europe too. For instance, Podemos in Spain is another party of interest. And so the puzzle I'm trying to ask is, throughout Europe after the Eurozone crisis, you started to see the rise of these anti-system challenger parties. But a lot of these parties, and they're mainly populist parties, they adopted different types of party forms and different ways of inter-party decision making that really differentiate them. So some parties were much more hierarchical and had a typical party form, while others like Podemos, the Five-Star Movement, were more horizontal, and they really campaigned upon direct democracy, procedural reforms of that matter. And so essentially, I graph a typology in my thesis looking at parties based on their ideologies, so competing on different policies, or competing based on their methodologies or the organizational forms they take that might differentiate themselves. And so I situate the context of my thesis within this competitive party landscape, thinking about what the strategy, what the strategic value is of these parties campaigning on reforms to the political process, as opposed to having distinct policies and ideologies. And so I realized I do a case study of Syriza in Greece and Podemos in Spain. And I realized that there are three main factors leading to the difference in these parties. They both have similar policy platforms that are anti-austerity policies. Syriza, though, is much more vertical and hierarchical, while Podemos really campaigns upon being more horizontal. It's kind of it's more plebiscitary in that there's a direct linkage between the leader and the party communities. And so I realized that there's three main factors that are leading to this difference in party outcomes between the two parties. The first is the competitive party landscape. So what the other parties within that country are doing. And if a space opens up within the ideological front for a party to come in and just campaign upon existing policies. If this field is already occupied by existing parties, then this new party might have to come in and differentiate themselves by, opening up party decision making, having a more horizontal structure. And so what I realized in Spain versus Greece is that in Spain there was this radical movement of the Social Democratic Party to the center, and it was really discredited by accepting the austerity packages. Meanwhile, there was also a rightward movement of center-left party too in Spain, but it was less extreme. And also in Greece, the far left-wing party was very weak. It was also discredited too. So there's this big gaping hole for Syriza to come in and just champion policies, mainly anti-austerity policies, and it could differentiate themselves in that. Meanwhile, in Spain, the competitive landscape was much more occupied by existing parties. And so this led it to have to differentiate itself on this opposite front. And the second main reason is voter demand. In Greece, austerity issues were more important. Meanwhile, and these were economic policy related issues. Meanwhile, for instance, in Spain, one of the primary issues was corruption issues. And with that requires procedural reforms and reforms to the political system. So essentially that's currently my idea for my thesis and where I'm at so far.
Thank you so much, Emily. I'll turn it over to you, Derek. I know you were saving your comments for Emily as well. Oh, so sorry. I think you're still muted, Derek.
Am I now unmuted?
I can hear you now. Yes.
Great. Okay. Anyway, it's marvelous. I love the conceptualization. Very exciting. And I really like it because it contributes to a general 21st discourse on rhizomatic forms of political organization and the search by people, whether it's through the ideological attachment or whether it's through new organizational patterns, that people want a greater sense of agency because so many people are feeling, lost. And my main question, though, is that you mentioned briefly in the proposal that right-wing parties just don't really fit in here, and I'm thinking that the new right-wing parties have been quite popular. And is it simply because there hasn't been an ideological space for these parties, and so they come in? I'm thinking of the AfD in Germany, for example, the Alternative für Deutschland party. Is it that these parties fill a needed ideological, space, and so they don't have to deal with the kind of organizational, technological change that you're talking about? But maybe actually a related question is, these parties can be kind of hybrid. I mean, I'm no expert on the AfD, but my understanding is that it has an ideological space that is very different from any of the major parties in Germany, but it also has its own organizational techniques. For example, the AfD, although it's a anti-immigrant and kind of white nationalist party, it has its own Jewish branch, and it has a way of sort of organizing Jewish activists. It has something called the Jod AfD, and they're kind of trying to reach into particular niche markets. And that suggests, again, a kind of, it could be more of a top-down organizational framework and less rhizomatic, as you seem to be suggesting about Podemos. But anyway, I just think this is a fantastic conceptualization, and I'll be interested to hear where this goes.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. I don't know if I should comment now or wait.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll do some responses now from the presenters. So Emily, why don't you go first, and then we'll go around to the other presenters so they can respond to Derek's feedback. So Emily, why don't you start?
Sounds good. Well, that's a really great question. And when I initially came up with this thesis idea, I was looking across the ideological spectrum. So both for radical left-wing parties, centrist parties, and also radical right parties. And so I saw that this phenomenon mainly arose through two main classes of parties. So first was the far left parties like a Podemos or Five Star Movement, and then the other was some of these centrist movements. So previous categorizations had considered, for instance, Macron's En Marche party also, or Ciudadanos, which is this Spanish party, also exhibiting this trend too. And they really pride themselves on being part of the virtuous center. So getting people from both the center left and the center right in a more participatory way. And so how I think that this mainly categorizes these types of voters as opposed to, for instance, right-wing voters is I was looking at studies that looked at both left-wing and right-wing voters' preferences for political organization and organizational form. And studies have come to the conclusion that a lot of left-wing supporters really care about more participation in politics, while typical right-wing voters are very much kind of in line, really go into the hierarchical nature of rules-based order. And I think so I thought about this for a little while, and I really see that I think that there's a strand now of these left-wing millennial Gen Z voters that really care more about participation in politics. And I think that part of it is the issues that are associated with left-wing voters go hand in hand with this more participatory notion of politics. So for instance, caring about racial and social justice, that in part lends to having these people that were once isolated and marginalized from traditional institutions now wanting to be included in those institutions. I think that puts pressure on the existing format of political institutions. And I think one of the second reasons also for this, that you see this mainly on the left, is caring about issues like climate change and other post-material values. A lot of these require big change in how currently institutions and the current economic structure are being conducted. And that's also going to put stress too.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Great. Francesco, would you like to go next?
Of course. So thank you so much, Professor, for your comments. I think that these are questions that I will be asking myself many more times as I continue writing. The two things I wanted to mention, so you spoke about buying into the healthcare services for foreigners, so for migrants. That works in Italy for people who already have a residency permit. But people who already have a residency permits tend to already be part of the national healthcare system because that's a requirement in the residency permit. A lot of my participants were irregular, quote unquote, migrants, so people who could not buy into this. But actually, that's not as big of an issue as one might think, because under Italian law, they have access to emergency, continuous, and another form of healthcare that in the end, it means that if they show up to a hospital and they require something, it will be given to them. Yeah, but why exactly? Yeah. But why exactly that doesn't happen, or why exactly they choose to not use those services and use the third sector, or what's not available through those services was my main question. And for your point about when it's politically, feasible or politically justified to not give care to this group of people, I think I was in Italy during a very unique time, because of course, when you have a public health emergency, you're not taking care of citizens anymore, not just citizens at least, but you're taking care of the public. And that actually created incredible amounts of shifts in the way that this organization worked, and the public and private really came together in ways that I did not expect at all before going there. So I think that I truly hope that those points will come up much more clearly in my thesis. But thank you so much for pointing them out, because they are a very important question at the core of my argument.
Eliza, would you like to go next?
Yes. First, I just want to say thank you for these comments. They're extremely helpful, and I'll certainly be thinking about these when I write my analysis. I wanted to say about my interview pool, I definitely get how it can be a little limiting. There has actually been a lot of work done on the intersection of education and nationalism and youth and nationalism. And so I'm planning on using that lens to sort of analyze my results. Like Benedict Anderson, I think, says that the more educated you are, the more nationalistic you become. The modern research, especially about America, has shown that if you don't have a college degree or you're less educated, then you're more nationalistic. And so my research is very interesting because it's a lot of nationalistic people who all mostly have higher education degrees. And so I'm planning on using that as a focus, as well as their youth, and seeing how that affects them. And to your point about the formation of their views, I'm really glad you mentioned that, because I actually did measure that in my interviews. I asked them kind of what their political journey was like and how they got to their thinking now. And I have yet to do a formal analysis of this, but my initial impressions are that for those who are sort of politically cognizant in 2014 around the independence referendum, because the voting age was lowered to 16 for that. So if they were 16 or 15 or 17 around that time, they really became politically aware and kind of did their own research and formed their own views then, and have since stayed politically active. But for those who were maybe 13 or 14 in 2014 and they didn't have that space to really think about those political issues, Brexit was the impetus for them to start thinking about these issues. And most of this was typically during their secondary school period. I also asked about whether or not they thought their university education influenced their views. Most people by and large said no, but I do think sometimes the university environment created a discussion amongst each other that they ended up forming some of their views there anyway. But so thank you for all of this. This was incredibly helpful.
I can just quick follow-up. Anderson's comment on the relationship between education and nationalist sentiment is really true for the 19th century, the era of the kind of high bourgeois forms of nationalism. There was a sea change in the 1960s, and the curve, as it were, begins to part. And then you get the situation where people who are more educated become less nationalistic. So you might want to look at a different body of literature. I'd be happy to suggest some titles to you where you see then that the curve kind of goes the other way, and that might explain some of what you've come across. But anyway.
Wonderful. Let's have Nate.
Hi, thank you for all your comments. You mentioned Krakauer, who I know was an early mentor of Adorno. I have not really looked into him that much. I'll be sure to do that, and that'll be, I'm sure, useful. I realized that Adorno is in the title, and I pretty much explicitly talked about him. I spent a decent amount of time this summer also exploring other works of Ernest Bloch, Bertolt Brecht, Lukács, and Marcuse, and some other Frankfurt School associates, and their sort of other similar interactions between theories about the interactions between aesthetics and politics. Yeah, Benjamin is obviously a really huge one, and what you said about the aura really resonated with me. I think there's a very similar line of thought in Adorno's conception of music and his conception of the connection between music and critical theory, where he's very concerned with sort of the spatio-temporal aspects of music, the idea of it as a performance art form that the viewer experiences in a finite period of time, and in which sort of there is in this artistic experience there's an interplay between the viewer and the piece of art itself, or the piece of music, or the performers, and all of that is very similar to Benjamin's idea of what the aura and what cannot be reproduced. So I definitely think that those arguments, there's an interesting connection there, and I'd love to explore that more.
And one person I would suggest, which is something that came to mind from my own wife's research, Paul Lazarsfeld actually would be quite good to look at as well, because he's done quite a bit on radio, and he quite good interlocutor, especially when you're thinking about Adorno as well. But I'm an early modernist. I try not to venture too much into the modern period. So
no, Lazarsfeld is really great. I read some of his stuff this summer. They were together at the Princeton Radio Project. Actually, Adorno did a little whole thing where he wrote a very critical article on the NBC's radio music appreciation hour.
Yep.
And I, for quote unquote fun, tried Adorno then, which never got published, made his own radio appreciation music hour, except it was 12 hours because, of course. And I did a little project where I forced myself through the 12 hours of that, which was interesting. But anyway, yes, thank you.
How about Taylor?
Sure. So first of all, Dr. Penslar, thank you so much for your feedback. Very, very helpful. So on a few points. So the first point about, kind of why this obstruction of justice undermines the legitimacy of the state. So yeah, that's definitely a really great, I think, further avenue that I'm really hoping that I gain more insight on through those in-person interviews, because, a lot of the interviews I've been able to do so far have been kind of, people around, NGOs and international organization officials, but there are not many Bosnian politicians hopping on a Zoom call with me to discuss corruption in the country. So one thing I have heard from a lot of interviewees is it'll be much easier for me once I'm in the country, to grab coffee with someone who has maybe some insight in what's going on. But my hunch right now is that first of all, the three major political parties in Bosnia definitely exploit the ethnic tensions to kind of promote their own nationalist agenda. So as much as they can keep people thinking about the past and keep people kind of engaged in not necessarily engaged, but these war crimes trials are dragging on and on. That makes it easier for their goals, and specifically the Bosnian Serb Party. Obviously a lot of the prosecutions are against Bosnian Serbs, and any kind of recognition from them, there's a reason why they haven't really recognized Srebrenica, undermines the legitimacy of the Republika Srpska. And so because that would mean it's a state founded on genocide. And so one thing that Dodik, the Bosnian Serb president, has said time and time again is like he wants Bosnia to look incompetent. So if it's the interest of the international community for these war crimes trials to be efficient, if they're inefficient, that's, more Western scholars, more policymakers thinking, man, there's no way Bosnia is going to be able to continue to do this on its own. So I think it's one part of kind of a system-wide assault, but I definitely want to get more into those political interests through more interviews. Second point, really great point on corruption. That's actually something I got to interview a woman with the Organization for Crime and Corruption Reporting Project, and she made that distinction as well, where she was talking about, a lot of times we think about corruption, we think about it in a financial way. That's not really what's happening as much. It's definitely more so kind of a political influence way. So I may want to think about reconceptualizing that, or at least making that clear whenever I do my thesis, what I'm referring to. And then the third part is also a great point on the political interests of my interviewees. I've definitely realized that. My first interview was with someone from the OSCE who gave me very, very on the record, like kind of exact answers of what their reports have been saying. But I've also gotten to dig a little bit more into anonymous interviews, and that has been a lot more interesting for me. So I think striking the right balance between, you know, having people on the record, but also having those anonymous interviewees who are willing to say a little bit more, because if you think about it, the OSCE as an institution wants to preserve a working relationship with the Bosnian government. So they're maybe not coming to me and, you know, complaining about political influence and corruption. So those would be my main points. But yeah, I'm hopeful that continued research will allow me to address those even more.
Wonderful. And since Leo and Yuki have very similar related topics, I'll leave the last bit for both of you to respond to.
Sure. I guess I can go first since I presented first chronologically. Thank you for your comments. With respect to like where the exactly tourists are going, I didn't want to like name drop specific areas too much, since I think the main point was just that there's a lot of like heterogeneity in revealing these, like, I guess I would say latent capacity for more dispersed tourism within outer areas. I'm not sure like if those areas like specifically are going to be the ones that end up seeing this, but the graph that I showed is actually areas within like the outskirts of the mainland area, so the areas away from like the really intense historic center, where there's like the very like those really high tourism values that we even found in our index. But those also include like Mestre, the other islands as well, and then the idea being that it's this delicate balance between like the livelihood of like most of the people that live in Venice at this point is really almost 100% based on tourism. But there are still lots of residents who live there, and there are people who would want to be able to come back, and to try to strike a balance between that by supporting things like infrastructure to those outer islands, but not, you know, building a bunch of like new souvenir shops. The kind of renewed interest in those and like spreading out tourism a bit, maybe the idea is that kind of enables, we'll start to enable that to take place. Although, you know, of course, I can't say like exactly where it's going to be, and I think that'll be a part of the future research, is to kind of make that a little bit more clear. You're very correct to, I think, try to push me a bit on being more specific there.
Yeah, and thanks, Professor Pensler, for the comments. I thought they were really insightful. And I'll just leave my response quick. I think from here on out, I'll definitely look more globally in terms of this phenomenon of subdivision, because you're right, it definitely is not local to Venice. And I think in my current research, I've only really looked at Venice. So I think that was definitely a great comment that will lead me to new directions in my thesis.
Wonderful, wonderful. We have a couple of minutes we can leave open for some general Q&A from our audience. So if you would like to, please send your questions via the Q&A function that we have on here, and I will relay them, summarize them to our panelists. If our panelists also wish to pose any questions, feel free to also post them there as well if you have questions for your other fellow panelists and peers. So I have one question, since I'll take the prerogative to ask first. Just very briefly, very succinctly, what would you say was the biggest challenge that you face in pursuing remote research during this last summer leading up into the semester? The biggest challenge that you've had to overcome? So let's start with Eliza.
My biggest challenge was definitely recruiting subjects. I just relied on my own personal networks, which in some way was a benefit, but I just think doing snowball sampling and getting people to actually agree to a Zoom interview was harder than I think it would have been in person, but also very fruitful when it happened.
Who'd like to go next? Francesco, I see you smiling.
Yeah, I mean, of course, I was in the peculiar position of being in the country I was researching just because it was my home country. and my own region. But I think that the main difficulty with doing ethnography is truly understanding what spaces can you enter during a pandemic. And of course, there is a big concern about how to keep your participants safe. And that was, I think, the most difficult thing about this, and just trying to continually question how to do this in the best way, so that, I am in the country, I'm here, but how can I do this in a way that is safe and aligned with all the regulations that are there was quite challenging, but also I lived through it with the people that I was working with. So it was also very interesting and productive.
Emily, would you like to go next?
Sure. So I think due to having to conduct online research, I had to change around my methodologies a little bit. Initially, I was also interested in doing interviews for supporters of the different types of parties I was studying. But, I was trying at first to contact and try to find supporters of these parties, but that was difficult. So I ended up taking more of a supply side approach and ended up basing a lot of my thesis more on theory than on this interview approach.
Taylor, would you like to go next?
Sure. Yeah. So I think for me, one thing I was really looking forward to before COVID was the opportunity to kind of learn more from people on the ground in Bosnia. Obviously, it's a very sensitive topic, and something that's really important to the cultural psyche of the country and to people. And so I think just navigating that sense of trying to be sensitive to the topics while on Zoom calls, and I didn't really have necessarily the opportunity to engage as I would have liked to, but I've been able to pick up a remote internship with an NGO in the country, and that's really helped me in kind of making more contacts, just being sure that, the ways that I go about doing my research are really responsible and culturally sensitive. And so I've been able to kind of navigate around that.
Great. Yuki, would you like to go?
Sure. So I guess for me, I faced a challenge of not being able to visit Venice. And so conducting sort of these architectural and urban design studies was quite difficult. And I had to resort to more digital means of doing that, and really like examining the historical maps of Venice, as well as Google Earth and Google Maps, which gave me the best understanding as possible. So that was for me.
Leo, would you like to go?
Yeah, sure. So I mean, similarly, we were planning on going to, both of us actually, to go to Venice and to get to interview people. But obviously we weren't able to do that. But I think instead we were able to have some conversations with professors at like the University of Venice. And that helped kind of direct some of my plans towards trying to come up with new data sets that we could look at to look at the COVID impact. And then, of course, as you saw, the project kind of really ended up being very directly about COVID, which, obviously that wasn't the plan before. But so I think it was a pretty hard pivot in terms of the plan, but I think led to some interesting directions.
Nate?
Yeah, so for me, I had a little bit of a shift in topics. When I was planning to travel, I was also planning for the thesis to focus more on concrete aspects of music education and music education systems in Germany. And so I ended up shifting to this much more theory focused topic. And that was the big adjustment. I still would have loved to have been able to actually travel and conduct some interviews, and feels like a rite of passage for anyone who wants to study the Frankfurt School to actually go to Frankfurt and see the archives. And there are materials there that you can't access digitally, but for the most part, it was about the major shift in topic, and then I was able to mostly just read at home, which wasn't that awful.
Anna?
Yeah, one thing similar to Francesco saying, I'm also in Belfast, so I've been lucky where I have been able to have contacts for interviews and so on, but have definitely felt restricted in sort of seeing things face to face and meeting up with people, because we are in a national lockdown, so there's no intermingling with households and so on. One thing that I have found helpful actually is, and Eliza sort of with the theme of Scottish nationalism, is even social media and messaging on groups. So there's like an Irish nationalist group which brought to mind that theme, and just a lot of people, I was surprised, are interested in talking and everything. So I've had to find different approaches to just message as many people, email groups, and so on.
Well, I'm in absolute admiration of all of you for overcoming these challenges and many others I imagine that you faced along the way. And it's been such a pleasure for me and for Sally to be able to help you and to be able to serve as this resource along with CES and furthering your research. And we can't wait to see where else and what other interesting and wonderful directions your research will take you. So first of all, I'd love to thank all of you for your presentations, and I especially want to thank also Professor Prenzlau for coming and sharing his time with us, and for all of you to make time for this, to share these remarkable insights into your research. And we can't wait to see, as I mentioned, where it goes. And stay tuned to our workshop work list. We will have some events for the spring as well, and hopefully we'll be able to highlight all that. But on behalf of Sally and me, I want to express my thanks and wish all of you all the very best with the remaining part of the semester. Stay safe, stay healthy. And thank you so much for being here.
I just want to quickly, just before everybody logs off, I just want to interject and just say, on behalf of Vasilis and I and CES, it's been wonderful to work with you all, and it's so nice to kind of see, what's come to fruition from the research. And we understand it was not what you expected over the summer, but it looks like a lot of productivity happened, and it's just great to see your faces, and we look forward to continue working with you all.